The argument from contingency starts with one of the deepest and most fundamental questions in all of metaphysics. Why is there anything here at all?
This question is really the launchpad for the entire argument. When we look at the universe, it exists, but it doesn't seem like it had to exist. It feels like things could have been different. There could have just been nothing. And this status, this property of could have been otherwise, is what philosophers call contingency.
So, a contingent being is simply something that relies on other things for its existence. And if you think about it, everything we can observe in the universe seems to be contingent. The universe itself, which is just the sum total of all these contingent things, is therefore also understood to be contingent. And this is the key. If something is contingent, its existence calls out for an explanation.
This is where Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz comes in. He took this basic need for an explanation and formalized it into a structured philosophical argument, all grounded on one core principle.
Leibniz starts with what he calls the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR for short. This principle states that nothing is just a brute fact. For any truth, there has to be a sufficient reason that explains why it's true and why it is the way it is instead of some other way.
Now, Leibniz draws a line between two kinds of truths. First, you have truths of reasoning. These are necessary truths. Their opposite is impossible. Think of mathematical truths. Their reason is found just by analyzing them. But then you have truths of fact. These are contingent truths. Their opposite is entirely possible. For Leibniz, the statement, "the universe exists," is a truth of fact, and that means it must have an external explanation.
So here's how the argument unfolds. It starts with the principle of sufficient reason. Since the universe's existence is a contingent fact, it needs an explanation. But if you try to explain contingent things just by pointing to other contingent things, you get stuck in an infinite regress, which never gives you a final ultimate reason. So the sufficient reason for the whole series of contingent facts has to exist outside of that series. This external reason can't be contingent itself, so it must be a necessary substance, a being that contains the reason for its own existence. Leibniz identifies this necessary being as God.
Let's illustrate this in a different way that I'm sure you'll be familiar with. Have you ever tried explaining something to a child who just keeps asking why? Well, as annoying as it might be for you, Leibniz thinks they're onto something. The child might ask, "Why's the tree there?" You reply, "Because it grew from a seed." That is a reason, but it is not yet a sufficient reason because it does not give a complete explanation. The fact that the tree grew from a seed is still contingent. It could have been otherwise. So the child quite naturally asks, "Why?" again. You answer, "Because the seed had the right conditions, soil, water, and sunlight." But again, this is only another contingent fact. So the child asks, "Why?" You continue, "Because of the environment, the sun shines, rain falls, and the earth supports life." Still, the child persists. Why? At each stage, the explanation you give depends on something further. Each answer is contingent, and therefore calls for another explanation. Why this rather than something else? You can only be said to have fully answered the child's original question when it no longer makes sense to ask why, when you have reached a sufficient reason, a complete and final explanation. Leibniz argues that this chain of why questions cannot go on forever. It must ultimately terminate in something that does not depend on anything else for its explanation, a necessary being which exists by its very nature. This necessary being provides the sufficient reason for itself and ultimately for everything else. Leibniz identifies this necessary being as God. Without such a being, there would be no ultimate explanation for why any contingent thing exists at all.
Now, this argument faces a very significant objection, and it targets that key move from the nature of the things inside the universe to the nature of the universe as a whole. The objection is based on what's known as the fallacy of composition. This is a well-known logical error that happens when someone wrongly assumes that if the parts of a thing have a certain quality, then the whole thing must have that same quality.
Critics argue that Leibniz's argument does exactly this. It observes that every part of the universe is contingent and needs an explanation, and then it concludes that the universe as a whole must also be contingent and need an explanation. The objection basically asks whether that inference is logically sound.
This simple analogy really helps to illustrate the point. Every single brick in a wall is small, but it absolutely does not follow from this that the wall itself is small. An objector would claim that the cosmological argument is making a very similar kind of flawed inference when it comes to contingency. Defenders of the argument, however, have a specific response to this charge. They argue that the inference isn't actually fallacious in this particular case.
The defense starts by questioning the core assumption of the objection. Is it really true that every part-to-whole inference is a fallacy? They suggest that whether the inference is valid or not depends entirely on the property that's being transferred.
Let's go back to that brick wall. Okay, it's true that the property of smallness doesn't transfer from the brick to the wall. But what about other properties? If every single brick in the wall is green, then it does logically follow that the wall is green. The defense's point is that some properties are transferable, and the inference is only a fallacy for those that aren't. And this brings us to the core of the reply. The claim is that contingency is a transferable property, like greenness, not a non-transferable one like smallness. The reasoning goes like this. If every single part that makes up the universe is dependent and could have failed to exist, then the whole that they compose, the universe itself, is also dependent and could have failed to exist. If this is right, then the inference is valid, and the universe as a whole really does require an explanation. So, the argument asserts that because the universe is made of contingent parts, the universe itself must be contingent. The objection challenges this directly, calling it a fallacy of composition. The defense then replies that the property of contingency actually is transferable from part to whole, which would make the inference valid. So you can see that the argument's conclusion, that the universe requires an external necessary being, really depends on whether you think that inference from contingent parts to a contingent whole is justified.
Ultimately, the central point of disagreement boils down to this one question. Is contingency more like the smallness of a brick, or is it more like its greenness? How you answer that will determine whether you see Leibniz's inference as a valid logical step or as a fallacious leap.